Hello and welcome to NewsClick and the Indian Writers Forum. I have with me today Raja Shehadeh, who is a writer, a walker, and I'm going to leave out lawyer, Raja. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
We are going to talk about your most recent book, Where the Line is Drawn, Crossing Boundaries in Occupied Palestine. There is, of course, the background of the land that you have explored, not just by living on it, but by walking through it in your earlier book, Palestinian Walks. But I feel in this book too, when you talk about boundaries, we have to look at three things. One is the land, then you have memory, that is history, and then of course human relationships. So if we could go through that and how difficult it is to negotiate these three aspects of life. To begin with the land, all through the book there's a sense of a competitive love for the land. So for you, the land means something. You, for example, you go to a nursery where the woman loves the nursery. She loves what the land is capable of producing. But for you, the knowledge that the nursery is built on a demolished Palestinian village means something else altogether. How do you negotiate that in a day-to-day life?
Well, the point that I was trying to make in the book is that it hasn't been the same throughout the 50 years of occupation, and it has changed a lot. And I couldn't explain that except by doing a book that covers the 50 years of the occupation. And I was interested in showing that it has not always been so difficult to cross from the West Bank to Israel, for example. And the relationships between Israelis and Palestinians were not the way they are today. Today, it's the worst situation that we've ever been in. And I wanted to show how we got to there through episodes that go over time and over across borders.
In a way, but this competitive love for the land also seems much more subtle and insidious, as in this example, because I think of some of the older stories of people sort of looking across. I think Darish spoke of how an uncle of his would look across and look at his olive trees across the barbed wire, but he couldn't go there. So now that is very stark and dramatic. But here it's almost as if it doesn't exist, So in a way, occupation is in your head. It is something, this woman could turn around and say, you are imagining this. Why are you going back into history and thinking of what lies under this nursery? So the competition for the land becomes much more subtle because histories are erased.
Well, histories are erased entirely, and there is an episode in the beginning of the book where I go to Jaffa with this friend of mine, Henry, and we're looking for a grave of somebody who was buried. He was the director of the hospital, and it's the hospital grounds, and his widow has told us where the grave is. And we wanted to see what state it is in to report back to her. And we cannot find it. And then a security person comes and says, there's no grave here. And he denies entirely the history of the place, entirely. And so there is denial all the time. And I think the denial that Israelis have of the existence of the Palestinians in the land is at the very center of the whole conflict, until they recognize that they came to a land that was inhabited and they took it over, not because it was an empty land. They cannot begin to make peace with the Palestinians. And the Palestinians cannot begin to make peace with the Israelis if they are not recognized as a nation, and as a nation that has been deprived of the places where it used to live before 48.
I think throughout the book there's what holds it together is a kind of discussion of modes of survival, not only as a collective but also individually. I was interested in the fact that you begin with this going back to Jaffa, where your family was, what you'd heard about Jaffa, what you remembered, and so on. And then you almost coming back to Ramallah, where you live now, you say, well, this is, why have I neglected this? So there is that kind of personal journey of also saying, coming to terms with where you are now. Would you give us an inkling of that process of the yearning, I'm not using the word nostalgia, but letting go of Jaffa in a sense, though you can never do that entirely, and then saying, this is where I am now?
Well, I think that the most important struggle for the Palestinians has been that of sumud, which is to stay put on the land, and steadfastness. And that is important to, rather than continuously just yearning for what is lost, building on what there is. So it's between recognizing what was and that there is a struggle to get that recognized by the enemy, and holding on to what there is now and building on it, because that's what the important struggle is about for the time being, to assert our presence in Palestine, which is completely threatened, not only by denial, but by physical threats of making life so difficult, so that we are encouraged to leave.
This whole business of the histories, of memories, isn't it hugely complicated by the fact that you have young people on the Palestinian side who don't remember, obviously, historic Palestine, and on the other hand, you have Jewish people like your friend Henry, who actually come from elsewhere and who have an entirely sort of, what shall I say, they have to go through a history which is not a personal history in this land. How does that play out on both sides? So starting with the young Palestinians.
Well, I don't think it's comparable between the two, really, because I wasn't born in Jaffa and I have no memories of Jaffa. But at the same time, Jaffa continued to mean a lot to me, and the fact that it's denied, that our history, the family history is denied, weighs heavily on me. And Ben-Gurion in the beginning had said, all the Palestinians in a generation or two will forget about Palestine and move away, and that has not happened at all. So you constantly meet with Palestinians whose families have left entirely Palestine, and gone to the United States or gone to elsewhere in the world and did very well, and wanted to forget, and build a new life for themselves. And their children and grandchildren become so tied and feel so attached and come back and want to discover and write and be active and so on. So it has really not happened at all.
And there's a very interesting aspect of sumud and of struggle, that the history too is not lost.
The history is not lost. No, the memory is not lost. And I think as long as we feel threatened by the denial of our existence, that spurs us into wanting to work harder and assert ourselves and work on it until it happens that we get there. We get the recognition and we get the self-determination. In the case of Jews coming to Palestine, well, I mean, Jews from Canada, as Henry is, have no physical relationship and they have never had any family in Palestine. And it's just that they feel maybe an attachment.
It's an abstraction,
an
isn't
abstraction,
it?
yeah. But the question in the book was that, is it possible to sustain a relationship without reaction to the injustice that is happening, and not taking any action to ward off this injustice? Can you say, I'm not political and I'd stay away and be part of a community that is inflicting this injustice on another community?
In fact, that's the center point of the book. I wanted to start with this background, but then finally the real question is, what happens to human relationships? because all through, I think you are talking about the day-to-day experience of occupation has this very, very deep ramification, which is that it dehumanizes both sides. So let's talk about this very intriguing way you have of tracing occupation, not only the day-to-day reality, but the history of it, as you have political vicissitudes, developments, and how that affects your friendship with this Canadian who has become Israeli.
Yeah.
Henry.
First of all, I wanted to make sure that it's a hopeful book, and it is a hopeful book because it shows and proves that relations are possible, and that it hasn't always been so bad, that people did meet and did start relationships in the past and so on, and that there isn't anything between an Arab and a Jew that makes it impossible for them to be friends. There are objective political factors that make it difficult to continue.
Would it be right then to say between a Palestinian and an Israeli, to say that you can have a relationship which is not fraught, which is not affected by political developments? Because very often when you're talking to Henry, you feel anything from resentment to bitterness, that he is not acknowledging what you are going through.
That's right, that's right.
So that is the struggle of the relationship.
That's the struggle, and that struggle went through many phases, and I tried to go through these many phases, because that's how it happened in fact. We started off at a time when it looked as if the political conflict would be resolved, and we were hoping for that, and then it didn't. And then it became more complicated and much more complicated with the settlements and with the difficulties that we were encountering in the occupied territories by the occupation, which was becoming a harsher occupation as time went on. And we could see that our land was taken and so on. And then, of course, there was the first Intifada, which was a struggle against all of this. And Henry insisted on staying away from it. And I couldn't take that, and at the same time I felt that I couldn't not tell him what I felt about him for staying away from all of that. And so in our relationship we did a lot of letter writing, and fortunately I had kept the letters, so I would write a letter telling him exactly how I was feeling, my anger and so on, and he would respond. And then it got to a point during the Intifada when I couldn't see him. I just couldn't see him. And then things happened that we were brought back together. And so, in a sense, the ups and downs of the relationship reflect, in a way, the ups and downs of the occupation itself and the history of the occupation. Although, of course, I mean, I concentrated on the individual, but then I didn't want Henry to be representative of Israelis, nor am I representative of Palestinians. Exactly. That's not the point, of course.
In fact, that made me curious. You know, we have, after all, groups such as the Boycott from Within. So you do have groups and individuals within the state of Israel, individuals who are Jewish, who would like to say, not in my name, and reject what the state of Israel is doing. I often wonder what is the kind of personal relationships possible between these two groups, you know, Palestinians who of course are part of the struggle, and the principled Jews, if you like. So it doesn't affect you, but on principle you're standing up for this. So there must be a lot of wear and tear in that relationship as well.
I think all along there have been solidarity between Israelis and Palestinians, and at certain times it was very strong. But then, of course, the present, well, it's more than the present now, successive Israeli governments have tried very hard to fragment the two, even more so than they were. And then with the building of the wall, the annexation wall, and they making it more difficult for Palestinians to visit, even to go to the other side, and making it illegal for Israelis to come to Palestinian areas made many of these relationships less likely because of physical separation. So the situation now is much worse than it ever used to be, although there were many times before when there was a lot of solidarity, cooperation. And at the same time, there are many groups now in Israel and individuals who are working against the government and opposing these actions. But of course, they're doing it for their own sake. I mean, it's very nice to be in solidarity with the Palestinians, but it's not like somebody in India, like yourself, doing solidarity with Palestine because you believe in the justice of the cause. It has no impact ultimately on your life, although it might in a way, because of in a way India is going through similar processes.
But it's one step removed.
But it's one step removed. Whereas in their case, they're very worried about the future of their country because of what it is doing, and because it is because the conflict is destroying Israel. It's really creating a self-destructive element of whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the democracy, whether it's the rule of law, because of this settlement project and the growth of the Orthodox Jews, Israeli Jews, the situation is becoming very grim to many Israelis, and many are leaving, of course. But it has a direct impact on their future. So that's partly their incentive.
And this possibility of sort of a human crossing of boundaries, I think what Darwish called humanizing the enemy. Would it depend on where you are? The West Bank, the imagination can still sort of take in a stray friendship, like what you describe. But if you are in Gaza, for example, or what if you are within Israel, and the Palestinians officially called Israeli Arabs. How would those sort of locations affect individual human relations?
Of course it would affect, because it's very difficult in Gaza to have.
Exactly.
But at the same time, there are relations.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, like Amira has lived in Gaza for a long time and has strong contacts with Gaza and concerns and friendships and so on. Even though it's very hard to meet, but they do exist. But it's much more difficult. At the same time, I think there is a whole generation now in Palestine of people who have never had any encounter with Israelis except as settlers and soldiers. And the brutality of the occupation has become such that it creates such anger and hatred, which is not healthy, of course. And ultimately, my belief is that however the political situation is going to be, there are an Israeli nation and there is a Palestinian nation, and that's a fact, and that's a fact. And the two would have to find ways of living together. And in a way, I intended the book to show that it is possible, and you can, if the political objections to that and impediments are removed, then the two can live together and can make something much better than either of them can do alone. And that's what I
there is a sort of a pragmatic base to what you say, but you also imply that there's been a shift away from the strategy of resistance, as in the sumud phase, to would you say that more and more with the youth there is a sense of anger, and sumud has to be expressed in a much more direct way, not so much in this kind of staying here, I will not leave this land, but I will also fight for it in a more direct way? Do you think both in terms of violence and resistance that there is a shift to that?
I think violence is not so popular, because anybody looking at the past, violent periods have not brought good results at all. And Israel, if it wants to use violence and military opposition, Israel has the upper hand by any standard. So I think the position is that it's nonviolent resistance and international solidarity that would make a big difference, and building Palestinian society so that people can stay. That has proven to be the most important. Sumud is not a passive thing. There's something very active about Sumud, and persevering and staying put, because you're fighting against a force that is doing its best to make it impossible for you to stay. So, and so for example, the wall has meant that many thousands, something like 40,000 people, live outside the wall, in between Israel and the wall. And when you see the difficulties they have in reaching their land just to cultivate it and to
or to go to school,
or to go to school and so on, they continue to do it, and they refuse to leave, and they refuse to leave it. Just before I came, we went to visit something which was amazingly inspiring. It's in the southern Hebron Hills. Sarura, the village is called. And Sarura was a village which was depopulated because the army declared the area a training area, army training area. And they moved them out. And now they realize, the people next door, who also struggled to stay put and had to do the impossible to bring people back to the village, they realized that the settlements on the east and the west are trying to join using the land of Sarura. So they have made a campaign and an active process whereby they live in a cave in the land and are trying to bring back the people from this cave on to further settlements so that they can recreate the village. And of course, the Israelis went and confiscated everything that they had around, and yet they persisted and stay and sleep in the cave day and night. They're there in order to prove their sumud.
Raja, I wanted to actually end with asking you, who have had contact with India, not just in terms of visits, but also with individuals and groups here who are in solidarity with Palestine. What would you tell the young in India who have grown up in a time when they didn't see Palestinian students in India, when they didn't have the memory of our freedom struggle fresh in their minds when our freedom fighters took a stance for Palestine? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that there are similarities, lots of similarities between India and Palestine. Of course, with the size, it's another matter. But 48 is such an important date for both places. And the militarization of the struggle is very important. And the role of Israel now is more and more important. So there are similarities between the two. And sometimes looking at the smaller struggle, which is Palestine, can help Indians understand the bigger struggles between India and Kashmir and Pakistan and so on. And the role of religion, and the role of the manufacturers of weapons, and the role of the unfortunate role of making the conflict into a religious one, which is bringing disaster to all of us, whether Indians or Palestinians. So I think it's helpful for Indians to look at the situation there and understand. And also, there is something, a commonality. We are all human beings and react in similar ways and make the same mistakes and fall for the same delusions. We have to understand each other and be in solidarity with each other.
Actually, in the book you have a rather powerful formula for survival, which is, you say, that you don't want to lose yourself. So in a way, whether in India or Palestine, the political struggles and the use of religion for politics, in a way, it drowns out the self. It makes relationships impossible. Thank you so much, Raja, for joining us.
Thank you for your